It is a wonderful honor to welcome Pie-Pacifique Kabalira-Uwase to this program. He currently resides in South Africa, and he authored a wonderful and powerful memoir titled Witnessing from the Rwandan Tragedy to Healing in South Africa. And much of our discussion this hour shall be focused on his memories of the Rwandan tragedy or the Rwandan genocide. Pie-Pacifique, welcome to the show. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm doing well and I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Yeah, so let's begin by me saying that one thing that still shocks me to this day is that the Rwandan genocide, as we call it in the international press, it's only a very recent event. It occurred 30 years ago this year. Um, and I don't believe that the country has fully recovered from it, judging by its current regime. So I'd like to hear from your perspective. How has the country moved on from it?
Well, moving on from a tragedy of that magnitude, I think for any country would be extremely difficult. That is, I'm very sure that some statistics that sometimes some people disagree with, but you had close to 1 in 8 people killed, and it was not massacres by the army, it was by the rest of the people. So in most instances, it was people killing neighbors. And so you have almost 100% of the population having vivid memories of what happened and the trauma. Particularly, that's, I think, individual and collective trauma. And unless there is a concerted effort to deal with the trauma in an intentional way, the healing and the moving on becomes a very slow process. Now, there can be debates as to whether there has been efforts to deal with the trauma of as a consequence of the genocide in Rwanda. And one can also appreciate that it is extremely difficult for politicians to do that, because how do you open conversations, some of which can literally become political to the point where they can compromise the very people who might be leading these conversations or leading this political discourse. So it's a difficult one. It's a difficult equation to solve. I would say Rwanda has done extremely well in moving on from what happened in 1994. But the road is still very long, especially when it comes to dealing with trauma. And I'm speaking from experience because I'm looking at the work that I had to do in order for me to be open and talk and write about it. I can tell you that one of the major enabling factors for that was the fact that I was not in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. So it's still a lot of work to be done.
Now, one piece of news that I suppose was reported but escaped much of the international press is the conviction and later exoneration of one, and again, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, Paul Rusesabagina. He was famous for being depicted in the film Hotel Rwanda, starring Don Cheadle. He was the hotel manager who sheltered people who fled from being massacred, and he was wrongfully imprisoned by the Paul Kagame regime, which is present in Rwanda right now.
Yes.
So give us your perspective on that event.
So Rusesabagina himself, having lived through the genocide, having done the things that are attributed to him, actually saving a lot of people in that hotel. It's actually called Hotel de Mille Collines. That actual hotel is Hotel de Mille Collines. So they changed the name to Hotel Rwanda for the movie. The aftermath of that movie it didn't go as planned for the Rwandan government.
Mhm.
So they welcomed the movie. It was actually screened at a stadium in Rwanda. So it was a great movie for Rwanda.
Mhm.
But Rusesabagina, the character himself, not long after, started having some dissenting, making some dissenting opinions, to the point where he actually brought a case to the International Tribunal for Rwanda, the heart of which was to say we can't only investigate the alleged perpetrators of the genocide, we also need to look at the terrorism and crimes and war crimes committed by the RPF. And it was a very controversial move on his part. So the government then started distancing themselves from him. And then he became actually an enemy of the state, so to speak. So it was not surprising that he was eventually arrested. And I'm sure you know how it happened. Literally diverted a plane that was carrying him under false pretense to Burundi, but actually they were taking him to Rwanda. And God knows how many laws were broken in doing that. But then he was tried. So there are two ways of looking at it. One is, does a government have a legitimate reason to try somebody they view as inciting and participating in acts of terror against the country and destabilization? Yes, that right exists. Does the person himself actually qualify for that, tick all the boxes for this to be legitimate? That's where the question mark is a big one. And so from how he was brought to Rwanda to what he was being charged with to the history and that complete U-turn from he's a hero even in Rwanda, and then boom, U-turn to he's the enemy number one of the state. And then when you look at the evidence that was presented, there were some European Western witnesses that actually appeared in court. And some of the things they had to say were substantial. Some of the conversations about, we need to do this, we need to do that. They seemed to be containing elements of intention to destabilize the country. So it became complex and it became very political, and of course an embarrassment now to the international community, because he's a Belgian citizen who is a permanent resident in the United States, who was literally, I don't know if the term is renditioned, right? So that created a little bit of embarrassment. And so there was this international political pressure that also came into the mix, which sometimes you can't, even if you look at the whole Rwandan genocide, you can't take out the role of the international community, however it may be qualified. And so there is my opinion is that Rwanda wanted to show that irrespective of who you are, they will get you. And I think they made that statement clear many, many times. You know about the attempted assassinations here in South Africa. At least one high-profile assassination was successful, and the intelligence services in some of European countries and in the US have been warning Rwandan refugees that they have credible information that there are individuals who might bring harm to their persons, that they need to be careful. So there is this show of authority and force and ability, that wherever you are, whatever you do, we are watching you, and if you want to get you, we'll get you. And that statement is very clear. And I think it has terrorized a lot of people who might well have intentions to do anything in opposing the Rwandan government from outside or even from inside. So from that point of view, there is success. And how he was released, I don't really know the terms under which he was released or how it all happened, because he was convicted, he was already in prison. So that, I think it was negotiations with the United States, etc., etc. So you can see, for me, this is one case that shows how complex the Rwandan genocide, but also the Rwandan story is. The story then and the story right now.
Yes. And that brings us to the Kagame regime. I believe he's been in power ever since the 90s, so sometime after the genocide ended. So I wonder, from your perspective.
He was not the president after 94. He was the deputy president, but he was the de facto leader of the RPF, and then he became the actual leader of the RPF before he became the president of the country. So yes, he was the de facto strong man in the country since 1994, at least some argue.
So what is his claim to power even now, and to what extent can his rule be, well, I suppose, shaken?
Typically, I avoid having conversations about that in a way that then that is simply because there's a lot in the Kagame story that is difficult to understand, because there's just a lot that is outside, that is not in the public domain. So if you look at the Kagame, the individual, I read an amazing book, Do Not Disturb. It's the title of the book, Do Not Disturb, Michaela Wrong. Even as a Rwandan, I found myself really learning a lot about the genesis of the Rwandan Patriotic Front in Uganda, because that's also where his political story really starts. When you look at the individual himself, his main focus, his education, his upbringing, and his profession was in military intelligence. And it wasn't just in military intelligence for a government. He studied military intelligence for a rebel group that has the particularity of starting a war from within the country. So usually rebel groups, they attack from outside. It might be interesting to look at what people call the Luero Triangle. They started within the country, Uganda, and then they expanded and they took over the country. Now, to be responsible for military intelligence within such a group, you have to have certain skills, and you have to have a certain approach that protects the group from inside, from within. And so he gained reputation himself while he was in Uganda. Then, of course, he was part of the Ugandan government. He was still in military intelligence. And then the war started in Rwanda. Now, it is a fact that he wasn't there when the Rwandan invasion took place. It was actually apparently in the United States. Then leaders, at least the main leader of the rebel group, was killed. Then Kagame came after and took over the rebellion. Even that fact is very contentious because some think that he had something to do with it, whereas others assert that that Rwigema, that was his name, General Rwigema, was killed by the Rwandan government army, so in combat. So then he had to protect this rebel group. And then, of course, they won. And if you look now at what happened since, his closest friends, they are either dead or they are in exile. And I mean military, the military friends, chief of staff, the head of intelligence, they are either dead or they are in exile. So that means that at some point there were serious divisions, and he found a way to assert himself and stick. Now, he has achieved a lot of good things for Rwanda. There is no question about that. There are some things, some reports about how Rwanda manages international donor money, how clean the country is, the universal health care, they get things done. A lot of those things are true. But there's also a lot of things that some experts think are not true. There are some, at least one professor, Rwandan professor of economics I think he's now in Canada. He wrote a book called I think Kagame's Mirage. Yeah, it's something about Rwanda's numbers not really adding up. And what he says is that he was part of people who actually cooked them up, right? That is simply not true. So it is controversial, very controversial. Kagame says he will keep the country safe. He will prevent another genocide from happening. That is, of course, a very big thing. And there seemed to be no one who can challenge him. Anybody who could is no more or is away.
Right. So I quickly look up the title of the book that you refer to is Kagame's Economic Mirage, and the author is David Imbara.
Yes. Imbara, yeah.
Wonderful. I shall check that book out. So
it's a fascinating book, actually, that puts a lot into perspective. So in other words, there is it's like, so at some point it becomes really difficult to tell what is true and what is not. Now, in all of that, I am sure you would know, right now there's a lot of pressure on Rwanda to review their policy, lightly said, in the DRC, or on the DRC. So now, if you include the DRC and what happened, and if you look at the whole geopolitical conflict now, it adds another dimension that can only speak to one individual, because him being able to do all the things that he was able to do militarily speaking, And so to some, he's a great asset. To others, he's a villain. Now, to Rwandans, elections are coming up, he is a hero. To many Rwandans, he's a hero. So the road ahead, it's really difficult to tell. However, we know we are human beings. Nothing with human beings lasts forever. And I think he's the only person who can determine what happens after, right now. He has an opportunity to do that, because if he doesn't, I really struggle to see what Rwanda would morph into without him. Morph into, and I want to say, I struggle to see it happening peacefully as well.
Okay. So you've mentioned the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, a few times. So tell us who were they, and what was their mission?
Rwandan Patriotic Front.
Yes.
The Rwandan Patriotic Front is now is a political party, but it was actually the rebel movement that invaded Rwanda in October 1990 from Uganda, and they were made of refugees who were in exile since the late 50s, when there was major uprisings that some call a revolution and some just call incited uprisings. But when these events happened, the result of them was that Rwanda then became a republic instead of a monarchy, and a lot of Rwandans went into exile in Uganda, in Burundi, and even in the Congo. And so Kagame himself grew up in Uganda, as I said, and with most members of the RPF. And then when the political history in the early 80s of Uganda really defined what happened, because some of these refugees became high-ranking officers in rebel groups, in particularly Museveni's National Resistance Army in Uganda, and then became senior military officials in the Ugandan military when Museveni took over the power. And then they had the means to then forcibly return to Rwanda, because there are reports that the then president had refused to let them return peacefully. And so they had to do it forcefully, by invading. And so that's where the Rwandan Patriotic Front comes from. Now, it is seen as a Tutsi rebel group, and it is seen as protective of Tutsis. And so when they invaded, the then government, which was seen as a Hutu government, kept making reference to the RPF as the cockroaches, Inyenzi, as they call them. But then the distinction eventually got blurred between the RPF and the Tutsis. And so everybody who was a Tutsi was then called a cockroach. And everyone else who did not support whatever the extremist Hutu government was saying at the time was seen as sympathetic to the Tutsis or the cause of the RPF, was also, whether you were Hutu or Tutsi, you were also called a cockroach. That's the case of my family, by the way. We found ourselves on the wrong side of the fence, so to speak, because of my father's political history in the 80s. And so we were cockroaches, even though my family is considered Hutu. But that meant that we were among the people who had to be killed during the genocide in 1994. So the acts of the RPF as a rebel group, for example, if there were suspect acts of mass killings of Rwandans by the rebel group, they were attributed to the RPF, but it was quickly transformed into, you see what the RPF is doing, this is what the Tutsis want to do because they are killing Hutus. So they used some of these massacres as evidence for what will happen if nothing is done. And so you give it a few years of that kind of fear, and yeah, it was a time bomb. And so you needed only a trigger in 1994 for the things to explode. But that's the RPF, is Rwandan Patriotic Front. Now is the Rwandan army now is called the Rwandan Patriotic Army, and the Rwandan Patriotic Front is the political party now. It's one of the political parties in Rwanda, but in truth, some say that it is the only one in Rwanda. Yeah, so that's the genesis.
I think one of the most basic facts about the Rwandan genocide is that the principal perpetrators were Hutus and the principal victims were Tutsis. I suppose this is where I should ask, who were the Hutus and who were the Tutsis?
Now, that's a very interesting question, because literally this question, the answer to this question depends on who you're talking to. And I mean in Rwanda. Right? So let me tell you, before 1994, I was in school, I was taught history. And part of it was where the Hutus and the Tutsis and the Twas, there is a third ethnic group called Twas, where they came from. Now, that according to that story, the Twas are the indigenous people of Rwanda. They were there before. Nobody really knows how they got there, but from where this story begins in the history that we were taught, they were there. Then the Hutus were more farmers, land cultivators that migrated south from the region of Chad, and came and eventually also settled in Rwanda and around Rwanda. That the Tutsis were the nomadic tribes that were herders that came from more from the east, so from the Horn of Africa, and also they would have come and converged. All the three groups then were in that region together. And over time, they organized themselves into a kingdom. And that's where things are said that the Tutsis were then at the top, then the Hutus, who happened to be the majority, but the Hutus then were next, and then the Twas at the very bottom. And that the king of Rwanda had to come from the Tutsis, had to be a Tutsi. And so, but once he became the king, he was the Rwandan king. And so there are tales in Rwanda where the king, one of the strongest, how can I say it, where if he swore about something, in the strongest way, he would say, and I swear, and if I'm wrong, may I become a Tutsi. In other words, him no longer being the king, the next, demoted from kingship would be Tutsi, right? And that actually, even between Tutsis and Hutus, there are tales of people who became Hutus and people who became Tutsis because of what they owned or what they had or what they did, So how then it became tribes that are physiologically different? That's where the lines became so blurred. So the Tutsis would be tall and thin, and then the Hutus will be stronger, but more able, suited for hard labor, and then the Twas kind of fizzled out. It was, to this day, they are barely mentioned anywhere in any of the things that people say about Rwanda. And so in 1959, then, what he said is that there was a Hutu revolution, because the first generation of people who finished seminary from the Belgians, they created one school, and that was for the elites and for people to govern in the future, and it was only for Tutsis. And at least that's how it is claimed. But the missionaries would not, they planted schools everywhere, and so their seminaries were inclusive of everyone. And so the first generation of Hutus who finished high school, they were like, hang on a second, we are not inferior. We are the majority. And by the way, we want a choice on whether we want a republic or a feudal system. And so then that's how this whole revolution, there are many other details, of course, including the role of the colonies. And so then there was the first Hutu republic. And then a coup d'etat in 1973, another Hutu government. And that's how a lot of the Tutsis then ended up in exile in the late 50s, including Kagame's parents and many others. So when you talk to Tutsis, what they are going to say is that Hutus and Tutsis didn't exist. This whole thing of them coming from Chad and others from the East and others is not true. And that Hutus and Tutsis was simply the way the economy of Rwanda at the time in the kingdom organized itself, and that there was no Tutsi and no Hutu, and that it is something that was brought by the colonies to divide. Right? And so this whole revolution was never really happened. It was just an incited overthrowing of the king. But Hutu scholars and what they will say is no. Hutus and Tutsis do exist, and Tutsis were superior, and Hutus were their slaves. And so there's this whole thing about slavery that actually became the heart of the conflict. And so even in 1994, in the 90s, the extremist Hutu politicians would say, you remember what was happening then? Slavery and this and that. And that's what they are bringing back. So there are divergent views on really the composition of the Rwandan society before. But it remains that there are Hutus and there are Tutsis and there are Twas. And even the current government acknowledges that, because they no longer want it to be said that it's a Rwandan genocide. They want it to be a Tutsi genocide, or a genocide against the Tutsis. They made a formal application to the United Nations to have that changed. So it has to be a genocide against the Tutsis. But this is where things become a little complicated. If you read the Rwandan constitution, in the Rwandan constitution, there are about 7 references to Tutsis. Right? If you take into account the table of contents, it's probably 3 key references. And guess how many references to Hutus or Twas are in the constitution of Rwanda?
I'll say somewhere less than 7.
0.
Oh,
0. Right? 0. So my question then becomes, what happens if a child learns about, by the way, these references are about acknowledging the genocide and protecting and making sure that victims of the genocide against the Tutsis are taken care of. It's enshrined in the constitution. But there is 0 reference to any other group. So if you are a child and you learn about the constitution of Rwanda and you learn that the Tutsis, you go home and you say, who are Tutsis? I always wonder what the parents will say, right? So Rwanda is still in search of a clear how can I say this? There is no full acknowledgement that there are Hutus, Tutsis, and Twas, but when it is convenient, it will have to be mentioned, right? But otherwise, no, we are not Hutus, Tutsis, we are just Rwandans, right? But there's a lot of things wrong with that, especially in the future, because, of course, some people see it as a way not to open a conversation about what really happened in 1994. Again, so you open it on some circumstances and then completely close it in other circumstances. So the question of Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda is very, very difficult. I don't know if that answered your question, but I suppose it's it is as the answer is perhaps also a reflection of how complex the issue is.
Yes, I certainly get a sense of that from getting your answer. I suppose if there is going to be a genuine Truth and Reconciliation Commission about what happened in Rwanda in 1994, and you were invited into that panel discussion, what areas of historical reckoning would you like to open up?
I think as far as Rwanda is concerned, all areas need to be opened up simply because previously the story has always been told from the victor's perspective. So if you look at before 1994, the history we were told was about the Hutu revolution and the slavery and the way they referred to the monarchy and all the practices. So they taught the history in such a way that Hutus would be victims of Tutsis. Now, after 1994, the history as a subject was banned for some time, and then it came back. But there were some history lessons, especially to candidates to university. We would go into a camp. All candidates to university had to go to a camp. We called it a Unity and Reconciliation camp. That had also an element of military training. But we had to be re-educated. And the version of the history was to say what you've been taught is wrong, and if you really listen or read between the lines, what was written, it just makes Tutsis victims of Hutus. So it's like there's this vigorous claim to victimhood that the story of Rwanda is told by whoever is in power. And it's difficult, for example, in the case of the genocide against the Tutsis, to dispute that. It's very difficult because there was a genocide. So, but whenever there is this version by whoever is telling it, it just is so. There is no discussion about it. In fact, in some instances, it is criminalized to question the veracity of the history as told or as said by the whatever the prevailing authorities are. Right? So I think all areas would have to be reopened. What really happened in 1950, in the 1950s? Was it a revolution? Was it a Hutu revolution? Was there really slavery? Was it an overthrowing, or was it? There was a referendum, by the way, to vote whether we want a monarchy or a republic. It is recorded by the United Nations. Was this genuine referendum, or was it not? Yeah. And then what happened in 73 when one Hutu president basically overthrew, another, and the question of Tutsis also was in the mix. Apparently, one was more extremist than the other, and then there is the issue of Rwanda is so small, but believe you me, there is the north and the south, and the people from the north are Bachika, and the people from the south are Manyenduga, right? So what really happened there? And then what happened in 1994? The plane was hit by missiles. Who shot that plane? And whose instructions was that plane shot? And then all of the questions that are open at the moment, which is there were a lot of massacres in Rwanda after 1994, a lot of them. My brother was killed in 1998. Those massacres, it's still, they are documented, but nobody really talks about it. So there is a lot of areas that remain open, and in some instances, there are open wounds to many people individually and to some collectively. But there is a lead on that. And some actually argue that maybe it is for the best. Because what happens when you open all these things? Some argue that maybe it's the best. We leave it behind and we move forward. We create the economy, the fastest growing economy in Africa, the cleanest country in Africa, and we just create the country, the brand that now everybody knows about in Rwanda, and we just forget about it. And everybody will have their arguments for or against. But as far as history is concerned, if there was any discussion, everything would need to be reopened.
Before we move on, I'd like to say I'm tremendously sorry for your loss. That must have been painful.
Thank you.
It
was very difficult for my family, but you can imagine in Rwanda at some point, I think it remains the case. It's really difficult to say that the government committed massacres. The government army, the current government army committed mass killings. That could be a statement that can land somebody in huge trouble. Now, we are not talking about a few people. We are talking about thousands and hundreds of thousands who at least lost somebody or witnessed and survived these things. In the book, I write about the story of a young lady who, at that camp, the Unity and Reconciliation camp, asked a very poignant question, which was about, yes, the government is assisting orphans of the genocide against the Tutsis. But what she was saying is, what about the orphans of the killings by the government? Are these not children? Are these not orphans? Why only assist this, but not those? And it was an extremely difficult question for the authorities to answer. I remember you could have heard a pin drop in that massive tent where we were when she asked that question. And it's a question that is still relevant now. Who do you assist and who do you not? Because the Rwandan conflict was long, even if you look at the recent history from 1990 to, at least the early 2000s. And in the middle, you have the genocide, yes. And you have a lot of other things that happened. So when you are going to assist victims, do you only assist victims of the genocide? Do you assist all victims? How do you do that? It's still an open question.
Okay. So you've lived in South Africa for a number of years now, I assume.
Okay, 23 now.
Oh, wow. And I wonder, from your perspective of living in South Africa, to what extent has the country, I guess, processed its reconciliation between the groups after 1994, which is the same year as the fall of the old apartheid regime. I understand that apartheid and genocide are not two things of a different nature, but still, those are the two things that require some sort of reconciliation. So
yeah, you are asking about South Africa?
Yes.
My experience of it is that South Africa has created a very solid foundation in 1994 in the constitution, the constitutional democracy. I mean, you have organs of state that actually work. Right now, it is in the news that the Speaker of Parliament is either handing herself over to the police or is about to be arrested, and she's challenging her imminent arrest for corruption. Right? We're talking about the Speaker of Parliament. It's probably the second or third most powerful position in the country. So you have the constitutional democracy here actually works. And it has been tested over and over and over again. And it has triumphed. So that is a solid foundation. Having said that, the consequences of apartheid are still very much here. The inequality, the majority Black people, of course, living in conditions where it's extremely difficult, for example, to work. You still have to, lots of them have to use public transport or private transport to go to work because of how the apartheid structured things. And it's taken a long time for the government to address some of these issues, housing, and of course you have a lot of poverty in many areas, and then you have a lot of corruption. And what strikes me about South Africa is that it's probably the only country you can say this about the best in the world you can find here. The absolute best in the world. Whatever the area you choose, you can find in South Africa. And the absolute worst in the world, you can also find here in South Africa. The poverty, the crime, the corruption, you can also find that. And what you're seeing is that the best in the world is colliding with the worst in the world every single day. There's no dull moment in South Africa. But this is where, to specifically answer the question that you asked, is one of the things that I'm seeing is that the conversation about the consequences of apartheid, at least the trauma, again, I'm coming back to the trauma of it, I don't think that conversation has taken place. I think there is still a lot to do in order to deal with the trauma of the apartheid regime and the brutality thereof. Now, it's important to note that it's not only among those people who are poor, but it's actually, I think even the ruling class in South Africa is suffering from that, which is why I think there is a significant struggle 30 years after to actually do things properly. So that is a strong opinion, but I think South Africa still needs to deal with the trauma of what actually really happened to this country, because apartheid ended fairly abruptly. Then you had well-meaning men and women who inherited positions of high authority who were now going to run the country, but they had no time to update their inner software, so to speak, or their software. So whatever makeup internally that they had then is still with them now. That step was skipped, and I know it's an extremely complex process to facilitate, but you're seeing the consequences of it now, every day.
Yeah. So I'd like to end where your book begins, when you were named a Mandela Rhodes Scholar and you encountered the great man himself, Nelson Mandela. Why don't you recount to us that story?
Yeah, Nelson Mandela was a name I had heard since I was a 10-year-old boy. I remember my mentor at the time, I was in primary school, and he forced me that day under the threat of a quiz that I would get in the evening. And one of the questions will be, what happened in the world today? That day happened to be the 11th of February, 1990, when Mandela was released from prison. And of course, we would have learned a lot about South Africa. And apparently, I went to a Catholic affiliated school, so we would have, say, a prayer in the morning. And sometimes the teacher would tell us what we're praying for. And I remember praying for the liberation of the Black people of South Africa was one of the things sometimes we would pray for. So fast forward, I lived here in South Africa, and I got this scholarship. The foundation, the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, always made sure not to promise that we are going to meet Nelson Mandela because, of course, of his schedule. So I remember when I received the phone call that we were indeed going to meet Nelson Mandela. And it happened in Johannesburg and at his home in Houghton. But when I was sitting there, I just couldn't believe it. But when he came in, and the way he interacted with each one of us, because each one of us individually had a chance to go and interact with him, he just made it so easy. I remember when my turn came, he told me, "So young man, I hear you are from Rwanda." I said, "Yes." Then he said, "Please remind me, who is the president of your country?" So I said, "It's Paul Kagame." Then he said, "Oh, it is still that guy. And then he was the first to laugh about it. I have a beautiful picture captured actually of that moment with him laughing about it, and everybody laughed. But afterwards, we talked as if we had met before, and then what I encountered in the book was later that year, towards December, we were invited to have a luncheon with him. So we were privileged. The early Mandela Road scholars were privileged to have, every year he would have, we heard that it was one of his favorite things to do, to meet his Mandela Road scholars. So I tell the story of that luncheon, how I was at the luncheon, and it was just a few of us at a private home, and the coincidence of one of my best friend at the time, he was actually a waiter, and we didn't know we were both going to end up there. He was also a refugee like me. I was a guest, and he was a waiter, and we just found each other there. It was like, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "What are you doing here?" I say, and it was one of those coincidences that I reflected upon many, many times in the past. But again, the power of this man, Nelson Mandela, a lot of people question his legacy. Now you hear many voices saying he should have done things differently. But my opinion is that he promised one thing and he delivered it, which is one vote, one man, one vote. And the rest really was up to the inheritors, our friends, the inheritors to,
yes.
to do something with that, because they started, the current discourse started with an absolute majority for the ANC. Yeah. Now, we are 30 years later, we're not sure if the ANC is going to even get to 50%. We are looking at a coalition government, the strong possibility of a coalition. So what happened? I think it's high time people ask themselves what happened, because the ANC was seen as the saviors of the people, and now the narratives are completely different, quite the opposite, actually. So what happened? Where did it go wrong? I think it's time people ask themselves that. But South Africa, in my opinion, I think the foundation has a lot of safeguards. I don't think that South Africa is going to descend into chaos. I think the foundation that was built in 1994 is enough.
Yes, here's hoping. Okay, and on that wonderful note, thank you very much, Pie-Pacifique, Kabalira-Uwase, for joining this program.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure.